call is important to us.
Hello and welcome to tonight's show.
You've arrived at your destination. Connecting.
Hi guys, welcome to Glitching the Code here on iconic.com, and you'll be able to watch this on YouTube if they don't chuck us off, BitChute, and you'll be able to hear this on Spotify and Apple iTunes and a few others. I'm here with my good friend Johnny Vedmore. We did a really good interview for my deep dive show on Iconic a few weeks ago. That went down a storm, absolutely brilliant. And David Icke emailed me specifically about the show to say how good it was. But get a pen and paper ready because this information comes quick and fast from Johnny. So we'll be talking today a little bit about the Welcome 5, if you haven't heard of that, but also about the Tale of the Two Farrars. And now this is brand new to me as well. So I'm looking forward to this. Johnny, I will leave it to you to go into your flow because the information is so in-depth and so vast, and it will show how the gain of function research goes back well over 100 years.
Yes, it will. Thank you for having me back. And I'm really, really happy. Really, really wonderful platform to be on and to support. Is really free thinking. Listen, there's so much information. I wrote an article in January, and even though I knew that there was lots of other things coming, I mean, we had already reported Unlimited Hangout with Whitney Webb. We had already reported on Cyber Polygon and the up and coming events were going to happen, and it's all rolling out as expected. So we expected, any pandemic situation actually only lasts between 12 months and 18 months, and that was basically the amount of time that it lasted. So when it turned into 2022, I just felt like things had changed. January 4th, I could see things changing, and I had to finish this article and get it out there because there was going to be lots of other things, and really focus in on COVID and the British side of COVID, because everybody had been focusing on the American side all of the time, and what they don't know, a lot of Americans don't know as well, is that there was a massive British operational unit that had been set up many decades before to handle such things, to promote the idea of a pandemic and lockdowns and other things. They were the people who actually pioneered pandemic modeling that had been used to entrap us in loads of different ways. And they were this small group, all connected with the Wellcome Trust in the UK. And the Wellcome Trust has got a long history, goes back to Henry Wellcome, who was its creator. And he basically created things like pills and stuff, pill form, having medicine in that form, things that were fundamentally, you can go onto the Wellcome Trust archives and you can go and see all of the different things they implemented in the medicinal world, and some of them are crazy. He also liked naughty things like naughty sex toys and stuff as well, so he's a bit of a boy. But when he, like Cecil Rhodes and others, he would leave a will and a trust behind it, him, and he made so much money that became a really powerful entity. It had a private arm up until 1994, roughly. There was a merger around that time. I'll explain about. And it was extremely powerful all around the world, had research centers, research labs. It was the American arm of it was called Burroughs Wellcome. They were the people who introduced AZT, the controversial HIV medication that everybody knows is a gene killer. Even its research shows it just kills genes. It doesn't repair, doesn't help. It just kills genes. That doesn't matter what genes they are. It's going to kill it. So people always got sick, and of course they have autoimmune disease syndrome from it. Now, what a lot of people don't know, I once had a medical report back about something that was wrong with me, and it said in the bottom like AIDS, and I was like, what? what? Oh my God, I've got AIDS, but it's autoimmune disease syndrome. So you have something. I had something called Graves' disease, which was a thyroid disease, unknown where it comes from, but basically it lowers your immune system massively. And that AIDS is a description of that a lot of the time. You know, it's a lot of it is about the description of a disease that makes you autoimmune. And they say, oh well, HIV leads to it, and of course they were working on that principle that if we can get loads of people on HIV medication, this HIV medication that we're pushing out there, then we can make a lot of money. And they did make a lot of money from it. And it was very controversial. And people like, of course, Michael Jordan and stuff. It was Michael Jordan who Magic Johnson. Sorry, I always say that. I always say Michael Jordan. Yeah. Poor Michael Jordan. I'm sorry, but not poor Magic Johnson, because he didn't listen to the hype and he didn't take a lot of the medication. He didn't bother with all of that. He took stuff that was good for his health and continuing. I think he's still alive today, isn't he? Yeah, the fact is that there was obviously something wrong, and it's obviously medical jiggery pokery as always. But that was a very interesting time, the 70s and 80s, as all of that stuff was happening. There was another man who worked at the time for Glaxo when it was just Glaxo, before it became GlaxoSmithKline. He would actually be the man who would merge Glaxo with SmithKline, Beecham. And it's complicated because he actually merged Glaxo Wellcome with SmithKline Beecham. Yeah. But of course, Glaxo, in the time frame I'm talking about, Glaxo and Wellcome hadn't merged yet. So he was just the head of Glaxo. He went to American Institute for a while and then came back. Wonder what he did there. And then basically he was head of research. Now, I already come across Glaxo, researching Glaxo during that era when I was looking into the Kendall House case, where Teresa Cooper has written a lot about this. Teresa Cooper should be listened to. Her case has been proven. It's a proven case. It was a load of girls who were locked in a care home. They were basically just troubled girls, and they were treated as though they were completely mentally ill and experimented on. And the person who was administering all the drugs in this really weird regime of abuse, systematic sexual abuse, systematic psychological abuse. The girls slumped over each other, vomit all over each other, not treated like humans at all. You would not believe, if anybody looks at Kendall House, they will cry and cry and cry. I'd already looked into Glaxo because the person administrating the drugs was someone who Fiona Stripe, I think her name is, Strike, with a K, and her husband was also involved with research at Glaxo at the time, and it's really interesting that they were given medication like mufetinus, which has never ever been identified, even though it's recorded down there. They still don't know where it comes from, because they have a history of experimenting on vulnerable people. And what we see now, I'm not going to skip ahead too far because I'm going to go back again, so I'm going to go back really far. What we see now is that sort of like treatment that those girls got in the care home in a very like secure way, that they could manipulate and torture a load of girls who were literally, most of them under 18. Like sexual abuse, pedophilia, all of it. They were being raped, and that case is barely known. The same people, some of the same people who helped with the official review of that case, also did the Jimmy Savile case. So I mean, it's like, we're put in charge with doing that. So it's obviously that there is a unit that goes around and makes sure they sweep up all the information about this. And it's amazing no one knows about it, because you can read the reports, and the reports are in depth, and loads of people came forward as witnesses. It's as big as the Epstein case. It really is. And when I found out that it was Glaxo links there, I was very interested by that. But I got busy over years, did loads of things. I've tried to come back to it on occasion, and I did about a year and a half ago or so. And I'm in communication with Teresa Cooper about coming out, because she's still suffering the effects of autoimmune disease syndrome, of loads of different things, from being experimented on, being locked in a room for like 18 months. So something like that, crazy, the things that were done to these girls as well. no one remembers them, and those were the type of people they used to target, and now they're targeting everybody because they systemized that abuse to the general public, and they did it starting in the 80s and late 80s and early 90s when they decided, okay, a guy called Richard Sykes, this guy who's head of Glaxo, he's going up in Glaxo, and he says we need to, obviously he's saying behind the scenes, we need to control all of this, and we need to make sure we're in control of all of this and group and all of these pharmaceutical businesses are all going to be attacked eventually, so we should all defend. So his idea was to merge everything, so everybody shared their research. This would allow for centralization of research. This would allow for funding to be focused on certain would basically, big pharma organizations would share their research up. And at this time, Roy Anderson, who's behind me at the end there, he was the head of the Wellcome Trust. Maybe it was Wellcome PLC, because they said they like get rid of that, they disperse it into the other arm, they become just a trust after 1994. They kind of like reform what their identity is to kind of get away elation and scrutiny that comes with. That's one of the things that comes from this merger. But he basically, he is responsible, Richard Sykes is responsible for saying, let's merge, and he says this openly, merge academia, merge big pharma, and merge like public sector stuff together into one group, and all share the research and all decide where that money should go from. And he's then merges Glaxo, which is just come together with Wellcome PLC. He merges Glaxo Wellcome and with SmithKline Beecham. He's involved in then creating Beecham, comes to the side. GlaxoSmithKline comes out as one of the biggest entities, research entities in the world as well. And the Wellcome Trust is another entity that goes on. There's a couple other smaller bits that come out of that. But those are the biggest three entities. And the Wellcome Trust is now in a position away from regulation and with extreme power. And in 1994, they're running a joint project through Oxford University, and put in charge of this project for the Wellcome Trust and Oxford is a guy called Edward C. Holmes. He's right at the end. And Edward Holmes, he will be in charge of deciding where all of the Wellcome Trust's massive amount of funding goes, who gets it, which scientific projects, and more importantly, large groups of people who will be funded for a lifetime by them. So they basically control the scientists, and they're selected from mainly Rhodes Trust scholars in Oxford. I mean, I'm sure some of your audience know about the Rhodes Trust and the Rhodes Scholarships and Cecil Rhodes itself and the Anglo-American Empire. But for people who don't know it, that's quite a big thing. The Rhodes Scholarship is something where people who have been they've done a very good job in academia, but they've done very good in their actual lessons, training, and qualifications, but they got something extra that they can give, and they agree to everything the establishment wants to do. So they're the best ones to recruit, and they seem to go back to Oxford for a year doing a DPhil, so a diploma in philosophy, as a Rhodes Scholar. And this seems to be the training of the elite. And most of the people, if you look around in this group, most of the people are Rhodes Scholars. They're also, of the Wellcome Five, I'm talking about the underlings, really. They're like Rhodes Scholars. They choose from these sort of people. So at one time, in 1994, Ed Holmes was recruiting for one specific project for 35 graduates who will be funded their entire career. And those are some of the big names that you see out there during the COVID narrative, the creation of the COVID narrative. They were creating this, at the same time Richard Sykes is creating a merger, they're also creating something out of the Wellcome Trust, which is something much different than, it's something from the past, it's a relic from the past. And these guys would go on to do other things after this. After this merger was successful, and after the Wellcome Trust goes on a little bit, the Wellcome Trust would be funding massive projects. Loads of people all across the place. One of the people funded throughout nearly his entire career was Roy Anderson over there. And Roy Anderson had a group of people around him, including Neil Ferguson just by there. Neil Ferguson, everybody knows. Now, Roy Anderson is the mentor of Neil Ferguson. Neil Ferguson didn't know what to do when he was starting out and he needed direction. And Robert May, who was, I believe, then president of the Royal Society, said, hey, at a presentation that Neil Ferguson attended that he was presenting, said, hey, why don't you get with Roy Anderson and you go over to his school where he was a special professor, the Lineker professor, of zoology, and you learn about that and you study under him. And he said, all right, then that inspired me. And he went and studied Roy Anderson, also a member of the Royal Society. And Roy Anderson and Robert May cross over lots of times. He actually helped Robert May in writing 2 books, etc. So they're close friends. Robert May would also be one of the people left to scrutinize some of his actions later on for the government report. That's nice, isn't it? Neil Ferguson and Roy Anderson, at the turn of the millennium, something really interesting was happening, because there was like this rivalry going on in Oxford where Sunetra Gupta and some of her colleagues, Sunetra Gupta, some might know from the Great Barrington Declaration, one of the heads of that, was having an internal argument with Roy Anderson, because Roy Anderson had said she had slept around and whatever, and she hadn't. So she was pissed off, said, no, I didn't sleep around and I want him kicked out. And he refused to apologize at first, then acted like a bit of a clown, then apologized, then agreed to pay money to charity. But then the board of Oxford said, no, you've got to get out. And he said, well, I'm going to take my £7 million worth of Wellcome Trust funding with me and go over to Imperial in London then. Goodbye. I'll take all my research. I'll take Brian Spratt, someone who's also been involved in reviews later on to cover up something that Roy Anderson was implicitly involved in. It's amazing. This is amazing. These people, they just...
There's that kind of... Sorry, just to pick up on that moment. So there is this kind of... I get a lot of information sent to me and people saying against the Great Barrington Declaration. Is there this kind of genuine rival here, Imperial College? Or is this just kind of a theatre for the masses here? And they're kind of both controlled? Because if they know each other, there is maybe some genuine animosity, but it's controlled at another level. I get what you're saying completely, and from what I see, it seems like that. But it's a very complicated soap opera that's going on at this time and 20 years later in regards to those people. Sunetra Gupta, at this time that we're talking about, is married, I believe, to Adrian Hill, who would later go on to head up the Oxford AstraZeneca program. So he was the head of the Oxford AstraZeneca program, and he was Sunetra Gupta's husband until the Great Barrington Declaration. They had a divorce. So there's a sense that, well, maybe there was obviously an eternal rift. And Sunetra Gupta, during the time when Roy Anderson was saying stuff, was correct. He was saying stuff that was out of line. He was trying to push it down. So she was obviously a different voice. Now, that doesn't mean her voice is on the side of the people automatically. That doesn't mean that she's got the voice that's the righteous voice. She could just be peed off because someone's been spiteful to her. But the fact is that there's evidence there that Sunetra Gupta is acting honestly. And to be honest, I thought the Great Barrington Declaration was a bit of a hoo-ha that I didn't trust too much when I first saw it. And when I discovered this information, I was a bit more like, well, maybe there was some truth in it. But one of the problems I think people had with the Great Barrington Declaration was Sunetra Gupta was married to Adrian Hill, who was the head of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine programs. So it's really that is like hard for people to get over. And there is a lot of soap opera because, like I say, Roy Anderson left, he went over, and Sunetra Gupta had won in that sense. He was in a very prestigious position as Lineker professor of Oxford, and he went over to Imperial, and amazingly,
for no reason, they started studying foot and mouth disease. The foot and mouth disease hadn't been in the country for 30 years. There'd been no foot and mouth. There was no reason. They had a quick look into BSE. They had a quick gander around that. Roy Anderson was quite big into looking into BSE, but BSE wasn't something that was you didn't catch it from person to person. You got it from infected meat, so you could control that very easily. It was a very different type of thing. Normally, they looked at human transmittable diseases by human to human, or animal to human, as they love to go on about. But this was really weird. Suddenly, 1968 had been the last foot and mouth outbreak in Britain, but suddenly they're all over it. They put all of their research efforts into it. And that's at the end of 2000. And then we all know what happens it's about March, I think, 2001, where the foot and mouth outbreak happens. Amazing. It puts them really in prime position to literally take control of the entire response from Tony Blair. So Tony Blair gathers a board together. It's got some really good scientists, like a guy called Kitching, who's really good. He's fundamentally looks at evidence, but he was ahead of what's that? Not Porton Down, but the other chemical research place that they had. I'll remember it for later. But he was the head of really, really important research facility, and he was speaking sense. I think he knew that it had been leaked out by the government. He didn't know quite how it got there because he ran the lab that contained 500,000 samples they kept for the 7 different types of foot and mouth disease. Why would you keep 500,000 samples? It always infuriates me. It's like, okay, we need to back it up. How many times do we need to back it up? Well, we got 7. We need to back it up at least twice. And then you get 500,000 samples stored, and of course this sort of I think what you saw in the officials who had dealt with it before, who had been dealing with all this, is they were like, oh, I think this is our fault. Ooh, and they felt like that, and they were pushed out of the equation straight away by Roy Anderson and Neil Ferguson, who went straight up with the pandemic modeling. First time computer modeling had been introduced to the public, and to cause lockdowns and to cause some sort of reaction, and they showed their devastating models that if they didn't take over all of this, death would happen, and soon you could have loads of transmissions. And look, it's already transmitting to sheep. We're doing PCR tests. We know it's so. It really became obscene. In actual fact, there was a technique for vaccinating for foot and mouth, which was called a ring technique, where you start vaccinating 3 to 5 kilometers outside where you find the infection, and you go inwards like that until there's no infection left. And that was the traditional way of dealing with it. But this had gone around the country loads. They tried to blame it on one farmer, but that was bull. This had gone around the country loads. It was found over here, over here, over here. And I'm not sure if anybody notices, but you don't see many cows on trains and stuff. Yes, they get transported, but they get transported usually from the field they pasture in. They're in for the pasture straight to a place where they're either going to be taken for milk or they're kaputs. It's not like they go shopping out. They go to different farms. They go see their friends, and so the spread of it is always containable. So it was bizarre that it was all over the place, and that these guys had been working on it for so long. Why had you been working? Why did you change all your it makes so obviously they're in prime place. They pressurize Tony Blair. Tony Blair says you have to take over the entire response, and their worst case scenario unrolls. They just do it. They just do that. What they instead of seeing if that's the case and trying for anything else, they do a load of random weird testing, which doesn't really test. It's kind of like the PCR model of testing. I think it was a PCR testing for cows, really. That's really what they did. They claimed they couldn't do it fast enough, so they had to just kill if they found one infection. So instead of doing a vaccine ring, it was like find an infection, kill everything all around it. So that was the model they took. And everybody knows at the time what happened. They, at the time, the Ministries of Agriculture, Fishery and Farms, which will later be DEFRA, before they took over, produced the numbers of the people who were dying daily, and you could always see the day before and etc. They now split it up into 3 different sections, manipulated the figures, made it look like their techniques were making it like the amount of culled animals go down. But in actual fact, fact, they were raising the cull, and in secret, they killed, in the end, 8 million animals, and most of it wasn't seen, and they had to bring the army in. And this includes stories where, like, beloved cows in pubs who were friends with horses got shot in the head in front of all of the customers and dragged out by people in biochemical suits. And, the whole situation was bizarre, and afterwards they were rewarded. So they've done all of this damage to the countryside. Shouldn't they be held accountable? No. They had created a pandemic modeling showing that the epidemic modeling, sorry, in this case, because it's just one country, that the viral virus would be gone just on election day, when Tony Blair had reset, he had rescheduled the election, pushed it a month further down the line, and it would end literally on that day. And then they pumped up the killing, so they made sure that it would end. And all these guys would be rewarded. They'd get honors, and Neil Ferguson would get honors and stuff. And they would all go on to do other things which were really important. So Roy Anderson would go on to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whose World Health Organization stuff, really involved in the big elite sort of manipulating. So he would go to work for the Ministry of Defense. Neil Ferguson would come out every couple of years with a new danger, pandemic. Look, it's bird flu. It's going to kill 200 million. He said he literally produced models showing it would kill 200 million, and it killed like 670 something people. And same with different forms of swine flu and other things over the next the 20-year period up to almost 20 years up to COVID. And then COVID, of course, happens, and we see who comes out first, who on the British scene, who's the first one out there. Neil Ferguson, the man Neil Ferguson. He's got Roy Anderson much further in the distance now, because Roy Anderson's face was the face of the foot and mouth disease, with Neil Ferguson on the side. This time they've done the switcheroo to make sure there's a face change. And if you look at all of the talks Roy Anderson's given during that time, it's clear that he's talking the exact same line. Of course, everybody knows Neil Ferguson got caught doing this and caught doing that. But his model was something that would propel the lockdowns forward. His initial model that was 500,000 people would die in Britain alone, it's all going to be devastated, was exactly what he had done all of the time to try and spark one of these outbreaks. And during this time, they're given permission to go into every outbreak zone where an outbreak has happened, all the Ebola stuff and etc., and manipulate stuff and produce their figures and keep control of those studies that are coming from it, and create fear from it. So they've done a good job of that. And when this all happened, people who had been, someone who had been recruited by Edward Holmes back in 1994, maybe out of the 35 graduates, but it was just graduating from Oxford at that time, was Jeremy Farrar, someone a lot of people would know now the director of the Wellcome Trust. And was through the COVID pandemic. And he, of course, is an amazing figure to study during the pandemic, as is Richard Sykes. Both of those, what they did, extremely important roles. Richard Sykes was responsible for the entire rollout of the vaccines and all the booster programs in the UK. Everything was planned by him and designed and organized by him. The man who had successfully merged Glaxo, Wellcome, and SmithKline Beecham together and created this fundamental base where certain scientists who are funded by certain people can have access to all the research, and everybody else has to pay or like for the little bits, or just get the other version of the research. The research that means no one will ask any questions, and it'll keep them in power. So there's already, they had created this power base, and then suddenly he's in a position in 2021 where he's head of the UK Vaccine Task Force, and he's literally responsible for all of this. Richard Sykes is. Edward Holmes, he got to a point where he was did work all through that time. By the time it hit to the pandemic, he's the person who translated the first sequencing of COVID on January the 11th. COVID sequence was released on January 10th. January 11th, Edward Holmes released the transcribed version. I think he's going to get a Nobel Prize for it, something along those lines. This was while he was in Fudan University, and he had been in Fudan University since a few months before we think that the outbreak happened in Wuhan originally. It's extremely interesting that he's in China and they choose to put him in China in that time. And he's so important in the role of translating that. And his role afterwards is still promoting vaccines and promoting how terrible and dangerous COVID is and a lot of other things. He's still, when I mentioned the 35 people he funded for the entire career, he had loads of, he listed it down in his own CV. Loads and loads and loads and loads. You can look at it online. It's publicly available. It's within this article. You can see all of the many different like recruitment programs he was involved with, which would have funded people, scientists, for 10 to 15 years or 5 years. You know, there's like 30 groups who are funded for over 5 years, and there's 30 in this group who are funded for this time, and 30 in this. So it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the major scientists are all recruited through this systematic program of these elite educational institutes, and they sift through the ones who are going to do exactly what they say and abide by the narrative once it comes to the crunch. And those are the people who we see on our TV. Those are the people linked with all of these people like Devi Sridhar and others, who are the ones we see, who we get annoyed at. So Richard Sykes involved responsible for all of that, but Jeremy Farrar was responsible originally at the beginning of the COVID for, above Fauci and Whitty and people, as organizing the entire response to the entire COVID pandemic in the Western world, which seems like a very big responsibility for one guy. I can't understand why you would choose this one man. This was a man I had to investigate further. I had to go back further because, I mean, he was responsible for the economics behind it, the financing, the ideas behind it. He pushed everything to fruition. But he was also responsible for the SARS-CoV-2 cover-up, the actual paper, the proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2. He was a man who organized that paper within 10 days to be made. That was a lie. It's fake. It's fake. They're still, even now, they're producing papers and saying, we're going to do it again. They produce it again, and they're like, we got the same results again. It's fake. These people have lied. It's provably fake. It's even in their workings. You can work out it's fake. Everybody worked out at the time. And the people involved in that were Edward Holmes, were Andrew Rambeau, who's one of the people who's like, who they are the mentor of. He's a junior Royal Society member, you could say, and he is. He's a member of the Royal Society, but like an apprentice, lurking in the backgrounds. He's also University of Edinburgh. He is such, in my opinion, an arsehole. You can barely find a picture of Andrew Rambeau out there. He's very secretive about himself, and it's very interesting that. And since he's gone along with this, he's started to get things. He's making keynote speeches, and he's getting success around the place. Oh, isn't that convenient? All of these guys are members of the Royal Society. All of their underlings are members of the Royal Society. Most of their then underlings, the people under those, are members of the Road Trust. And Jeremy Farrar just seemed like, how can you have that much responsibility given to one man that you think you can get away with it? Like, that's like, we found this guy with like a van full of dead bodies in the back. I mean, oh my God. And when we talked at the beginning, Tale of Two Farrars, I went through Farrar really heavily. I could not stop at just 1994. Because it was too interesting. It didn't make any sense. A lot of his life. He's the youngest born of, I believe, 6 children. His father was Eric Farrar, and Eric Farrar got captured in the war back in World War II. In the war, as they call it. And he was a really interesting fella, got held until the end. And there's a little tale about how he got taken down to intelligence, to Ministry of Defence in London, by his future wife, Jeremy Farrar's mother, who was a driver who used to drive people who had come back from the camps, who had come out of the prisoner of war camps, would drive them down from Scotland to London, and they would be interrogated, I can't remember what they say, but anyway, they would be talked to by by the Ministry of Defense and find out any other operations or any other things that were involved. So that's an intriguing intelligence link with his father. But his father was born in 1917. And I found it very, very interesting that there was really not that much about him. But there was also that I like to track family histories, because you find the truth or you find a lie from really concrete facts and who people are born to and where they're born. You can't hide it. There's always rumors, there's always talk, there's always other things. And I couldn't understand something. I couldn't understand why Jeremy Farrar's grandparents, how they could be 52 years old in 1917 when his grandmom supposedly gave birth to Eric Farrar, his father. I couldn't understand that. I can't understand, because 52-year-olds now trying to have a baby.
Yeah.
I'm pretty positive that's nearly near enough impossible. And I kept checking over and over again, were these his real parents? And it doesn't make any sense. It's like, even like, he's born in 1917. They have a large family already, and their last kid is in 1911, and they have a kid when they're like 42, and then there's no kid like for a bit or something like that, and then there's no kid for a bit, and it just makes no sense. So I've included that within something else I've done recently, because I'm making something where I'm going back in time a little bit to find out where all of this gain of function research come from. And what I found really interesting was there was a man called Farrar in the past who was an epidemiologist whose life is identical to Jeremy Farrar's. And his name was Reginald Farrar, and he was the head of Board of Health for London. And Reginald Farrar is a very interesting man indeed. He also worked during his life. He eventually died of TB in the 20s while out in Mongolia, I think. He was one of those, he was traveling around a lot. Very interesting man, though. He would serve a lot of time in India. He was an epidemiologist looking at the bubonic plague, and the bubonic plague was wreaking havoc through the late 1800s and early 1900s in India. I'm talking hundreds of millions died. I never like saying stuff like that. It sounds so ridiculous that many people would have died, but I can't take in some of those figures sometimes. But people go look. It's devastating. The bubonic plague ravaged the whole of India, and he went and studied that a bit, and he kept coming back to be the Board of Health for London. But he started to get picked up by things like the Norton Trust, which was a trust at the time in the early 1900s. He would be, of course, the head of the Board of Health for London. He would also become a member of the League of Nations. And he would also go places under the banner of the Swiss Red Cross. So the very interesting sort of like links that he had. And in 1911, there was this fantastically interesting outbreak in Manchuria, China. And it was an outbreak of pneumonic plague. So where they had been studying bubonic plague for a long time, this was pneumonic plague. And so pneumonic plague is a little bit different. One's spread by ticks on rats and jumps onto skin, bats you get the plague. You get buboes come up, as I used to call them, little like plague boils. They go pustulous, you die. Majority of people died of plague. It was wretched. That's why it's called plague. The pneumonic plague is caught coughing, etc. This originated, is believed, and it seems to be correct, originated from the Tarabagan marmot in Mongolia, and parts of China, parts of Manchuria in China. And trappers would, back in the day, they used to hunt these by horseback. And if a Tarabagan marmot can't run, it's probably got the plague. If the Tarabagan marmot doesn't squeak all of the time and complain about being caught, it's probably got the plague. If it's got pustules under its claws, it's probably got the plague. And they knew this. But then there was the Western fashion market was booming, and everybody wanted fur. And marmot fur was quite fantastic, really, really warm and really used all about the place. So trappers, really like low down ones, and Western guys from outside would go to the marmot's layers, and they would dig up the burrows, and they would, in that case, find the dead and dying marmots because they go back to the hole to die, and they would then get infected with plague. And that's the start of the plague. Now, that didn't happen with the trappers on horseback because you didn't have that greed. You didn't have that sort of like going into their burrows and digging up dead marmots, because that's what they started doing. So that happened in about 1910. And by 1911, in the end of this, it was 60,000 people would die, because a disease like this could kill a lot more, but it's so terrifying. It was so terrifying. It was just, like, literally rushes through a community. No one can do anything about it, apart from adhere to being far away from people, especially if they're ill. In Mongolia, the people of Mongolia, if you had this, because they used to come across it, like trappers before used to get plague. They knew what it was. And what they used to do is sew them up in their tent until the smoke stopped. So they knew they were going to die, and they'd have to sew them up in their tent, and no one could go near them. And when the smoke stopped, it was time to burn the tent.
I was going to say, I often think the fire of London had something to do with eradicating the plague.
I think that a thought of it. I mean, the thing is that they by that time, by the 1600s, even though like things like Thomas Malthus and stuff hasn't hit there yet. Like there were precursors to the idea of reducing the scummy population, and rich people didn't want to walk around in London with the scum on the floor and the piss everywhere. I mean, you can't even imagine what I used to say. I grew up hanging around in castles in the sealed knot, like hanging around in castles on the weekend with my mates, and they still smell of 15th century piss. You know, you can still smell it. It's been hundreds of years of pissing on stone. The piss smell never goes away. So, you know, London was a wretched place to live, I think. But there was lots of disease. He was the board of health for London, so he's interested in this stuff as well, Reginald Farrar. But these Tarabagan marmots have obviously caused a load of trouble. Plagues hitting out, and the man who would sort it out in China, who would be put in to respond to it, was a guy called Dr. Wu. And Dr. Wu's an amazing man. He's actually the guy who invented the N95 masks. He is the inventor of the first mask, and that was to protect from a proper plague at a time that you could probably die. I mean, there was only 3 reported people who survived from this plague. 3 out of 60,000 people who died. No one caught it and didn't die apart from 3 people, and they were severely altered afterwards. They say severely altered. They couldn't breathe properly. One of them couldn't move properly, etc. And they'd been given testy stuff. But this was a really interesting time. People were dying, and science had reached a point in the late 1800s where they could do lots of gain-of-function research. They could do the first, it was the birth of gain-of-function research. And Dr. Wu would say, look, we developed systems. We locked down certain parts of society. We did things that were different than other people to control this in a certain way. And they didn't do it for an unnecessary amount of time. And even, you know, when I heard stories that when train people who worked on the train companies and stuff found out that there was plague in the city the trains were coming from, they would block off the train tracks and say you can't come in. Yeah. They would lock down themselves. There was an area called Fujian, and Fujian was split into 4 categories, and you couldn't move from one part to the other unless you had a band on your wrist. A band on your arm, a certain color, and if you tried to cross over the other area, you'd either have to be for work, and you'd have to have a special pass, like in a sense, a vaccine pass, a movement pass, to be able to move between one area and the other. And all of these guys in the West wanted to study all of this. They found it amazing. This was the first time where something had happened, and it had been so scary within, because even the Indian plague was so scary, but it was over there. We weren't unsanitary like this, but this could affect us. Something like this could happen to us. We should go study it and see. So all of the major powers sent their main men to it. Reginald Farrar was sent. Some people complained complained about his experience, but he had been to India during the bubonic plague. He did understand little bits, but I think he rubbed people up the wrong way. He seems like a bit of a character, like a fun character. And I don't think they were used to that back then, because Reginald Farrar, even though I don't know what he was doing, I don't think it was probably right. He was having fun. He was out there enjoying himself. Every photo you see him enjoying himself, and he was meeting lots of people. But there's something sinister underneath that agenda. Anyway, so 1911, Wu, just at the end of this pandemic, it is a pandemic because it goes across multiple countries at this point. At the end of this pandemic, calls an international symposium, and the major powers send different people. So in America, they send a Dr. Strong, who's was nominated by the Rockefeller Institute to be the person who goes and studies what's happening over there. In Britain, it would be Reginald Farrar, who's head of Board of Health for London. Japanese, it would be Kitasata Shibasaburo, who has I'll talk about him a little bit later. He's not a nice guy. He in 1911, just after the symposium, would be the installation of the last emperor of China. This would be the installation of Japanese rule. And for the next 20 to 30 years, they would experiment on the Chinese people as though they were animals, dogs. In one case, they would call them logs. They would call them logs for how they treated them. They would lock entire cities in and they would give them diseases. They were the most cruel and horrible people, and they would be involved. Now, the Japanese had really bad foreign relations at the time. They did not like anybody else. They saw everybody else as lower. So he didn't turn up to the symposium until the last moment and stuff. It was one of those. But Kitasato Shibasaburo would be the Japanese representative, who would, of course, then ravage China. So he didn't care about these people at all. There would be another one. I can't quite remember who, but basically those were the main contenders. They were the main people who were sent by the other was a Russian, Dr. Daniel Zabolotny. And Zabolotny, he was head of the St. Petersburg Women's Institute for Health. Seems a bit strange, is that? But he had done loads of research on loads of viruses, especially in TB. He had actually given himself TB at one point to try out a vaccine that he had made. And this is where the interesting thing comes in Manchuria. These guys all come supposedly for this symposium, a supposed symposium, but in actual fact, they've all got an agenda to do gain of function research on Chinese people with various viruses, including this virus. It would be a free-for-all. They would all arrive over. Dr. Strong and his partner would arrive like a month before the symposium so they can get ready for all of this, because they would infect, they would offer criminals who were sentenced to death. They would say, okay, to 104, I think it's about 154 criminals. And they said, we're going to give you this virus, and then we'll give you this inoculate, this snake oil that we've made out of nowhere, and we have no idea, and we'll test out on you. And if you survive it, you get to go free. And so they were like, all right then, and the majority of them died. And this happened over and over again. Even some of the doctors who were coming over, because this symposium was more than just those 4 people, it's a large group of people. Even some of those died from taking their own vaccines and their own remedies. Haffkine's prophylactic was one of them. Haffkine went out there himself to promote Haffkine's prophylactic, and it didn't work. None of them worked. They just killed people. But they weren't going to stop in gain of function research. They needed to know, so they all came together. And this was first time where it was the first international symposium where it looks like, honestly, a load of if you see a picture of it, it's a load of Jack the lads of the scientific community and a couple of people who look really serious. And they're all this is a new time, a new era for them. They get to test out on people. And from 1911, you get this rollout then of loads of different things that we see. Oh, I say a rollout because I personally, I'm really suspicious about the fact that after all of this gain of function research they're trying out for, like, say, 25 years, that suddenly you get the Spanish flu come up. And if you look in recorded history, there's not many times where you can actually record a flu pandemic. Before then, every time before, it's like, oh, that might have been, or that might have been. But most of them were TB or cholera or something else that was an old world disease. A flu was not something that was around. It seemed like just like came from that. And then there was another disease. The one that was Robert De Niro did a movie called Awakenings about people who had this syndrome that basically they went still and they couldn't speak and they were trapped inside their own body. They were completely and utterly unable. Sorry?
It's called Keys disease. Something like that.
Yeah, it very well might be. That rings some sort of bell, but I got a lot of bells in my head. But this sort of like disease just sprung out in 1915, 1916, and then went away and disappeared after the 1950s, never to be seen again. Never worked out how it transmitted, where it came from, what happened, etc. Now, I've also followed like the whole testing of biological weapons and stuff during the 100-year period up until COVID as well. And another article in the Ideological Clouds of Porton Down is called, also on johnnyvedmore.com. And you know, at the time, there was a race, a definitive, you know, it's all sides, all of the people who go to this symposium, yeah, and represent each of their countries. You follow their timelines, and it's all about gain of function research. It's all about control in pandemics. It's all about exerting control when there's not a pandemic or an epidemic, and making it look like there's an epidemic or a pandemic, or making it look more deadly. Because one thing that Reginald Ferran notes about his time, because he writes a long report on this, which is available, again, linked in the article. It's linked somewhere else, in actual fact, because the Reginald Ferran stuff, I'm making something called Controller Virus, which is about this sort of birth of using gain-of-function research to control a population and their virus knowledge to control a population from back in this time all the way through, because it's traceable and it's always the same actors, it's always the same players. And these guys all come from things like institutes, trusts, royal societies. They're all in these little elite groups, and they seem to have a lot of fun. They seem to have a lot of fun doing what they do. And at the same time, what they deal in is death. And if you see some of the things that they were doing, they were able to experiment on people through all of the 1900s and get away with it. And we know about it. And it seems very much hubris, a completely lack of reality, to believe that they're not still aiming to do the same thing today. And it doesn't stop in 1990. Like, you know, I follow up the look of how you can actually track their efforts to use biological weapons against their own people. I'm talking about the UK now. UK government themselves, MOD, spraying things like cadmium and stuff over large areas through ships, through trains, through anything cars, anything they can possibly use to gas as many people with this gas, well, whatever you call it, when it's a biological agent.
Sea spray was one I've heard of.
I did when I did the article, I discovered that there's loads of these operations, but they've all separated them up in different articles at different times, in little bits here and little bits there. And when you actually put them all together, you realize it's all the same operation. It's massive, and it'd been going on for like 40 years, where they're spraying people with cancerous stuff and deadly gas. And it's not just, it's like all of the British population. It's like tens of millions, all of the main places, the whole country. They made sure it was all sprayed with stuff. Some got it worse than others. So people in East Lulworth had a load of birth defects, which Brian Spratt then would help cover up. Brian Spratt, one of the men who's Roy Anderson's, one of Roy Anderson's underlings, who's been with who's been completely funded by the Wellcome Trust throughout almost his entire career. So these people are in control and do all of the reviews, all of the inquiries, all of the inquests. They mark their own homework. When they did the foot and mouth inquiry, they split the foot and mouth inquiry into 3 separate inquiries, and Roy Anderson and Neil Ferguson fell between the gaps completely. You know, untouchable humans who go back, and you go back over 100 years and it's exactly the same thing. A group of people working for trust and institutions that are actually arms of the government. Because if you go into the Royal Society, I tell you, there's little element like round table elements within that society who are responsible for doing that behind closed doors and getting their little guys who are all members of their club to go out and do some stuff that the government can't get away with. And the government goes to the Royal Society, speaks with these people, and these people get the stuff they shouldn't be able to get done, so they can cover up that they've been the ones who are responsible for the entire COVID pandemic and then covering it up. Now, the British side is the covering up side. The responsibility for gain of function research and stuff in the non-COVID pandemic, that's mainly been done by America and Chinese support. But when it comes to covering things up, who do you go to? You go to the best mobsters in town. You go to the home of the Greys. You go to London. You go there and you get the mobsters out and they go and sort out your problems. These guys behind me, they're mobsters. Jeremy Farrar put in charge of making us all look like a bunch of, making us all sit inside like a bunch of cucks. There's no other way to say it. Make us all have to have jabs. I'm really happy I did not have that jab. Everybody I know who had the jab are all ill all of the time. The one woman, I feel so sorry for her. The one woman in the park, I love her so much. She's such a lovely lady. I've literally brought up with her kids to her side. I've grown up with her kids in the community. I know them very well, same age as me and stuff. Really beautiful human. She's had a jab 4 times. She's had COVID like 3 times in the past month and a half, apparently, or 2 months. And it is insane. It is insane. They're constantly runny noses. They're constantly looking at me, and she's constantly saying, "No, you can't. I got COVID again." It's like I said to her, "But don't you see now the I didn't say it in a uppity way. I said the vaccines didn't help then."
No, my neighbour's had it 4 times. It's insane. So I think people can't separate out before we go. I mean, that there's so many different outcomes there. Like, what are they aiming for? Is it purely to kill a load of people off? Is it purely to make money from the vaccines, from the treatments? Is it purely gain of function to see what these things do and try and get ahead of how they were spread? Is it purely to change things so we usher in the Great Reset and have a cashless society? How do they facilitate all these different possible outcomes into? Do you know there's different agendas at play here? But
yeah,
you know what I mean. I think that's what confuses people because they try and look for one outcome.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that basically all evil shit works in the same way. Yeah, these people can't just go and implement stuff. It does not work. They have to get some form of idea of consent so they can get the majority of people just arguing against the other people who are rational. And for that, they do it in waves. So they push. So when you watch the foot and mouth outbreak of the past, you can say that was like a smaller wave than COVID, but a bigger wave than what you had seen 20, 30, 40 years before. When it comes down to virus stuff and reactions, they locked down the countryside and things. They tested out things that would then later be implemented in COVID. But when you see COVID, it's a much bigger wave and it pushes much further in. But we have this like system. They come back out again afterwards, but they'll never go back to the original place. And we have this going on every system. Every system, they push as far as they can. And it's like a childish sort of like get away with as much as you can while you can, and then go back and you get, you can get away with more next time. And it is just simply a human process. They go through this wave process constantly backwards and forwards, trying to push their agenda. So I think we can see them thinking, at least saying out loud, that they've been successful in some way at going enough to go on to the next part of their agenda, which is, of course, the more transhumanist side of the agenda, which includes implantables and liquids that go inside your brain and do all sorts of things that we can't even, we wouldn't even want to dream of. So these people they've pushed that far. They've got the consent now. 90%. I reckon probably 70, if they're lucky, percent of people had jabs in them, and so those 70% of people may not be up for a microchip, but 5-10% of them now, and it'll be more next time and more next time, and it's a gentle. ushering of change that comes in waves and pushbacks, and we've got to push back. We got to say every time we've got to pull them even further back, and we got to hold them to account. But we often can't do that. Their operations are really mappable. If we had a court system that worked, I could put together a case under British law with a group of people pretty easily, and we could go there and we could say, look at all of this stuff that's happened. We want these people prosecuted. We should be able to do that. We should be able to do that. We don't have a system for that at all. We see all of this criminal behavior. They don't give us any sort of system to be able to change. They are there, are ruling us, and they're doing it with a little smug grin on their face. Because if anybody goes and types Jeremy Farrar onto any search engine and goes look at a picture of him, you will see his little smug face looking like, yes, me, growing up in Singapore, hanging around in Asia and learning all of these interesting things at the expense of human lives. At the expense, he is a minister of death. And he's proven it in his actions and in covering up, even right at the start, covering up something that an innocent man, he would have said, no, I'm not getting involved in that at all. You crazy. But there's not many innocent men at the top, because people like Edward Holmes and others have recruited all of the top through their programs. This small structure of the Wellcome Five is 5 people in a very powerful unit doing a very important job for the establishment. There's loads of these small units all around the place, all doing their own separate things, but all aiming to get power and control over their own little portion of the cake in their own little way. And we have to fight against them, but for it you have to really break down who's responsible, what they're responsible for, and get down to the bare bones, because the rest underneath, all of those underlings, crumble as soon as you take the 5 away at the top. At any top, you take the top of any pyramid-shaped ideological structure or round table structure, you take away the top, it's gone. Everything underneath collapses in on itself. It has to be that way, and we haven't done it before. We've never been able to do it. But this is a point in time where we've got evidence. We should have a court system. We should have a judicial system that allows us to actually aim to prosecute people who are guilty of mass murder on a scale that I can't even comprehend, and who are still murdering people to this very day because of the actions they've taken.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? It really, really is. And I mean, just before we go, the connection there between Reginald and Jeremy, and if there is a connection there, it seems to me they do look down their lineage. For someone like Jeremy would have grown up and having doors open for him left, right, and centre just because of his bloodline. He'd been fostered into this thinking that he has a right to do this type of thing. That's why people don't seem to be able to get their head around. If they are indeed related, that would show quite clearly that this is how it works for them. But me and you, we don't get doors open for us. We have to unlock the thing and walk through ourselves. These people have spent their life having doors open for them. They never really worked for opportunities.
And there's secret doors. They're secret doors. They're doors that we don't see. You and me don't see the doors they walked through. When Jeremy Farrar was in his teenage years in school, he seemed like a spoilt child by the sound of it. And then he got kicked up the butt to start with a family business. And he's gone out ever since to work hard at being something. His father worked in loads of countries all around the world. It seems to be a thing I've seen over and over again in the post-war, where people worked in embassies and as diplomats around the place, or teachers in loads of different foreign countries, while these control structures are implemented in loads of different ways. So I think there's an intelligence link that goes back, and I think intelligence nearly always keeping it in the family. You don't have to compromise somebody. You can have previously compromised their father or their mother. and that person will also be under your spell. And there's a long history of intelligence compromise operations. So there's and a lot of people who are loyal to the state. I think that's part of it too. A lot of these people join the Royal Society for a reason. They have an ideology. It's an ideology that goes back to things like the British Raj and other things of the past. So I mean, the future is much brighter than these guys for sure.
Well, Johnny, where can people find your work and connect with you? And I'll put all your websites linked below. But thank you for your time as well.
Hey, that's all right. If you wanna read this, then you can go to johnnyvedmore.com. Up the top, you'll see a thing that says Fungi Monkey, and that's where I do all my media stuff. So if you want to watch the first start, the very amateurish start of the controller virus documentary about Farrar and these others, you can do. There's also loads of other stuff there. So Fungi Monkey, so like the good old mushrooms, fungimonkey.com, johnnyvedmore.com. I also do work for Unlimited Hangout.com, and I hopefully will be working with loads of other people in the future. But please have a lovely time and all look after each other, because there's people after doing very bad stuff to us all the time. We've got to look out for each other.
Well, cheers, guys. I'll put all the links below, and I hope you enjoyed this. Please leave comments as well, and please share this video as much as you can, and go and visit all of Johnny's links. So cheers, mate, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Excellent, boss. Thank you.
Your call is important to us.
Hello and welcome to tonight's show.
You've arrived at your destination. Connecting.